Hello, this is Father Bill Watson with Sacred Story Institute Jesuit Podcast. We are very fortunate today to have Jesuit Father David Nazar, who is currently rector of the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome. We're going to do 3 sections with Father Nazar, his early life up to the time of his being provincial in Canada, and then we'll take a break and look at his work in the Ukraine as superior of the Jesuits in Ukraine, and then finally his very important work at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome. So Father Nazar, welcome. We're very happy to have you on Sacred Story Institute Jesuit Podcast. And if you could open us with a prayer for our audience, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'll say a prayer in Ukrainian. В ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа. Амінь. Господи Боже наш, ми дякуємо Тобі за цей день, за Твою любов і присутність. Благослови нас і нашу розмову в ім'я Отця і Сина і Святого Духа. Амінь.
Thank you so much. You know, we met, David, in philosophy, but, you know, I ask the Jesuits on these podcasts about their vocation story, and I don't know if I know yours. So how did you get into the Society of Jesus?
Well, it depends how much time you want to give to this. But for me, I come from a large family in Toronto, an immigrant family. The family originally is from Ukraine, though we're all born in Toronto. And it was a Catholic family. We went to both churches, the Ukrainian Byzantine Church and the Latin Rite Church. Priests were always friends of the family. It's a very, very Catholic environment. My parents were very open, simple people without higher education. And so we grew up in that kind of environment. So I'm born in 1952, and I would say for the first dozen years of my life, every Catholic family thought they would have a son who would be a priest. And I think every young Catholic boy thought of being a priest.
Is this just Ukrainian Catholics, or was this all because Toronto has probably one of the highest concentrations of different ethnic groups in the world?
That's right. The statistic is 49% of the population of Toronto is born outside of Canada.
Okay.
So even going to school with kids of not only different ethnicities, but different religious backgrounds, even if they were all Catholic, they would be from different rites of the church and different cultures and all. So we were quite familiar with that growing up. Nonetheless, I would say that the Latin Church, because the Catholic school we went to was under the auspices of the Latin Rite Church, so its presence was very strong in our lives, as well as the Ukrainian Catholic Church. So, but when I got to high school, it was the time of the changes in the 60s. And all of a sudden, no one wanted to enter the priesthood. No one wanted to go to church. And it was a big mark of, my independence. I'm not going to church anymore. Right. But at that time, I was playing organ in the Latin Rite Church. And I thought that this will help me stay with the church. It was an affectionate thing for me, even though I went through those kind of revolutionary attitudes at the time. When I went to university, I just thought this priesthood thing was gone. I wasn't too interested in it anymore. But by the end of first year university, a friend of mine and I realized that we didn't know exactly what we wanted to do in the future. So we agreed. We had thought that after our degree, we would go to Europe.
Where did you enter university in Toronto?
University of Toronto.
Of Toronto, okay.
So one night we were finishing our last papers, and we stayed up till 6 in the morning just talking and decided, why don't we go to Europe now? Because we don't know what we want to do. Give ourselves some time to think about it. So that's what we did. We worked for about 5 months to make money. We went to Europe for 6 months. And one of our high school teachers was traveling to Rome towards the end of our trip, and we agreed to meet in Rome. So we were together for an evening, and I think we had a bite to eat or something. This was a very devout, very impressive man, older man. And he looked at me at one stage and he said, "What are you going to do with the rest of your life?" And I had never articulated it so clearly, but I said, "Well, I'm going to enter the Jesuits." And he said, "I knew it." So I looked up Jesuits in the phone book in Toronto. I didn't know any. And the first Jesuit I'd met, it was an extraordinary meeting of a guy who could finish my sentences, is the way I would put it. I would have a thought, and he would take me further than where I had been with that thought, and spiritual things and all.
And you're 22 at this time?
So I'm 20, not
okay.
quite 21. So he said, you should just go, and everything seemed fine, so enter. So I went and entered, and I must say I didn't like it. Most of them seem nuts to me, and
has that changed at all?
It has in a certain sense, but the church was going through its changes. I entered in 1973, and everything was going through the changes. So what was no longer. New things were there that made sense. But I would say a lot of people were still caught in the middle of, are we living the past, or are we living a future that we can't see? And at a certain point, I said to the novice master, listen, after 3 or 4 months here, I don't think this is making any sense. I should leave. And he said to me, I understand that, but I'm just going to say to you, stay and do the 30-day retreat. And if once you do that 30-day retreat, you say you want to go, then go. But at least give yourself the benefit of this, which is the core of Jesuit spirituality. And it was a very wise thing, simple thing that he said, but a wise thing that he said. Let me just tell you this anecdote. So I'm there in the retreat, and you do 4 hours of prayer a day, and whoever prays 4 hours a day, but here we are. And
where was the novitiate?
The novitiate was in Guelph, which is about
okay.
60 miles from Toronto. So it was a big retreat center. It was a 600-acre farm, so it was lovely nature and everything. A very nice retreat house, and very good directors at the time. Well, I remember for the first 4 days, sitting there for an hour of prayer, and I'm scrunching my face and I'm wrinkling and trying to figure out how do I concentrate and do this prayer thing. I mean, I knew how to read a book, the Bible, or I knew how to say the rosary or whatever. But to get into this meditation and contemplation was difficult. And it was on the 4th day, I was supposed to see my spiritual director, and after a morning's prayer, which was, again, just frustrating, I didn't feel anything during it, I just went out for a little walk. And there on the retreat property was the statue of Mary, and her hands are open in the gesture that wasn't giving and that wasn't receiving. It was kind of right in the middle. And what came to mind was a girl that I was very close to, that I had dated for about 2 years before entering, and she was just a world of love. I was much more analytical, and she was just this world of affection and love. And I had this image of how I would corner her in an argument and think I was winning, and then she would hug me or she would kiss me, and it just, all my arguments fell apart. Just sort of suffering. Well, that image came so strong for me while I was just by this statue. Then her image goes, and there's Jesus saying, I'm the one who's hugging you. Like, he didn't have to say anything, but that was the clear point.
Sure.
The love you were feeling from her was my love for you. Well, that's when the retreat just exploded open, and from then on, it was just very powerful and very moving, and the contemplations and meditations and all. So it was a moving moment, but one of the things that was so important, I think, for me and for Jesuit spirituality was God using our very history, showing you where he was in your history all along, and saying, this is what it's about if you have the eyes to see or the ears to hear.
Yes.
And it exploded open a whole bunch of things for me. People who had been in my life, events that were in my life, I saw them all so differently. So.
Well, it's interesting, because you were asked by this guy in Rome, what are you going to do? And you said, I'm going to be a Jesuit. And you just kind of picked that out of thin air?
Not exactly. It was almost that. The year, towards the end of first year university, I had gone to see the Jesuit who finished my sentences. And so I had a nice meeting with him, but I wasn't convinced about anything.
Okay.
So I was carrying on this question without clarity, very murky for all the time that we were in Europe. And I never brought it to any clarity. But his question was what brought the clarity. And the guy that I was traveling with, he was shocked. He said, where did this come from? And again, that was one of those moments where, had he not asked the question, I'm not sure I would have answered. I'm not sure I'd have given an answer to myself so clearly. But he knew me well. We were close when I was in high school and all. So.
I entered in '73 as well, and there were more people leaving than there were entering, and the world as we knew it was falling apart, and it was a crazy time.
Oh yeah. All my friends, even my parents' friends, who were very devout and church-going, said, what's the matter with David? and at the Ukrainian parish where my parents went to, and there were these people from the old country, very devout and very church-going. And my mother told me the story. One old woman came up to her and said, what's the matter with David? He's not ugly and he's not stupid. Why did he enter the priesthood?
That's what the guy I worked for. I worked for a guy who ran grocery stores, and I told him I was going to be entering the Jesuits. He said, "Why are you throwing your life away? You could do anything.
That's right.
You have all this talent."
That's
So
right. That's right.
people don't get it.
Yeah.
So we meet up then in philosophy in Spokane, Washington, and became good friends. You had a conservatory degree in piano. Where did you get that? Because you came with that to Gonzaga.
Yeah, I had studied music since I was about 10 years old in Toronto. At the Royal Conservatory of Toronto was well known in this kind of field. So I had attained a teacher performer degree with them in piano and musical theory and composition and all of that. And then at the same time, I was in the high school orchestras playing the clarinet and the bassoon. And because of that musical background, I was playing organ in the Latin Rite Church and even directing choirs on a couple of occasions. And music is very much in the Eastern tradition. So my parents were always, you're almost born congenitally able to sing in harmony. Because everything in the Eastern churches is sung in 3 or 4 part harmony.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you directed our choir for liturgies at the university during philosophy, but you were also the piano player of our rock group, the Bay of Pigs, and that's where we have all of our memories from college years. So college years as Jesuits, so that was fun. So, philosophy ended, you moved back to Canada, and you get a degree in theology and anthropology, which I wasn't aware of till some years later. So tell us about that work, and tell us about your 7 years working with First Nations people in Canada.
So when we were in theology, again, it was still the time of not only changes, but really trying to understand the changes that were going on at a social level, at a political level, first world, third world. Latin America had exploded open in terms of its importance for the world, and questions of justice and all of that. And along with that came an awareness of the importance of culture in the expression of faith. And it's a word that was really coined by Jesuit theologians, enculturation, meaning that the faith can never be expressed without a culture, without a language, which is the core part of a culture. And that came so natural to me because I grew up in 2 churches. It was the same faith doctrinally, but one church has no musical instruments. It's got icons, it's got smoke and gold, and people are singing all the time. And the other is the Latin church, which has a very different structure of its liturgy, with the altar then turned around in the sense of sharing a sacred meal and everything. So for me, it was very easy to understand the idea of different cultures are going to express the same faith differently. And in the Jesuits in Canada had a long tradition going back to Jean de Brebeuf of working with Native people. And it still was an important work that our province was doing. So I was happy to volunteer for that. And in preparation for that, I did a doctorate in this enculturation. So enculturation is basically putting together anthropology and theology. Anthropological insights as the ground for expressing the faith, meaning theology. And the idea was then to go and work with Native people who, again, have their own culture. They had received the Latin Rite Church, but there was a funny way in which there was a disconnect. So they have a deep spirituality, deeply devout, but they're wearing Roman vestments, and the architecture of the church is something you would find in the downtown of any city or town or something like that.
Sure.
And so that was really the challenge in those days, the 70s and 80s, was to allow Native expression of their culture in the church, which led to vocations and all of that. So I went to work on an island called Manitoulin Island, which is in the famous Great Lakes. It's a large island, a population of 10,000 people. Oh. And on that, there are about 5 reserves, we call them in Canada, reservations in the United States. And I was on the largest of them, which is also the oldest of them, where the language was still retained. About 2,000 people lived on the reserve. And the whole work then was, aside with all of the social issues, all of the political and economic issues, was bringing Native culture into the expression of the faith. And let me give you one story there, if I can.
Okay.
Because we had all these old vestments that were the old kind of classical Roman vestments, and it's one of the first expressions of a culture, because you're going to put on the vestments what makes sense to your culture artistically, aesthetically. So I proposed to the Native people who love to use deer hide and moose hide to make all sorts of ceremonial robes and decorations and all that. So I asked for people, and we got 16 volunteers. And I said, here's all the deer hide and here's all the moose hide. You people know what to do. You people pray and know what the church is. You put on these hides whatever you think is beautiful and appropriate for the church. Well, and I knew they're very respectful. They're not going to put on, jokes and limericks on the hides. But what it did was it exploded open their imaginations to putting on all sorts of symbols on these hides. When they were done, our celebration was on Holy Thursday evening, which is traditionally the evening that's celebrating the priesthood, the creation of the priesthood. And I had all 16 people up at the front of the church holding the vestments that they had made. There was weeping in the church. And the weeping in the church it's almost like saying, finally we see ourselves there. I mean, they were always coming to church, they were devout, but now this is the first time they're seeing their own self-expression there in the expression of the liturgy. I just remember the reactions of people were so deep and strong. So we knew we were on the right track with this enculturation approach.
Well, that's interesting because another fact that I did not know about you until later is that you yourself are a good garment maker, a seamstress, because you learned how to do that when you were growing up.
I used to work in a menswear store, tuxedo rentals, so I knew how to do the measuring and actually to tailor. That's right.
Okay.
It's one of my hidden talents.
Yeah. What was your thesis for your doctoral study in anthropology and theology?
So the thesis was that one of the ideas in this talk about enculturation is that the church has to go and plant the seed of the church in different cultures and then let it grow. And one of my arguments was that's not adequate because the expression of the faith is through the cross and the resurrection. So the notion of planting the seed is important. But the culture has to find its expression of the cross and the resurrection in the culture in order to appropriate the faith fully. And those kind of missionaries have to give their lives for this, pour it out, and then hear how God is speaking in the culture. Like, for example, even if it's a non-Christian group that you go to, God is already present there in the culture. God is already present there among the people, whether they know it or not. And so part of it is just to give that light, to give it air, to draw it out, and let people themselves begin to express it. So even our pedagogy or even our preaching was a manner of trying to preach in a way that was eliciting from people themselves their own expression of the faith, in which things like the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius became very important, to give people the authority to express the faith themselves and not just receive it from the priests, from a catechism or from a book, with the conceptualities of Western culture or of dominant white culture in North America, but say something and then hear how they would react to the same scripture passage or the same spiritual idea. For example, we'd have all these classes and spiritual exercises and little retreats we would do for people. And there's this one native man who said, we were talking about prayer and the most important prayers that people would find in their lives. And this one man who became a native deacon, in other words, a spiritual leader in the community, said, for me, it's the sign of the cross. Who says that, how many words is it? 15 words. Who says that that's the most important prayer? So we asked him, well, why would you say that? Because I take on the name of the Father. In other words, I become his. There's a great tradition in native cultures that you give a name to someone.
Sure. And
you become part of the community. So when I went there, they gave me a native name. And they would often call me by that native name. So when we say this thing in the name of the Father, God is giving us his name. He's calling us by name. I live in the name of the Father. I belong to the Father. I mean, as I say, it's only whatever it is, 15 words or less. But the depth of richness for native people, with just something as simple as in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, was rich and profound. If we just kept preaching and never listened to them, we would never know that. But how can you deny the importance and the insights that they have from that we just sort of blow over to get to the next prayer,
Now, I've known other Jesuits who've worked with native peoples, and I had heard that individuals have to discover their name. They go out and kind of do a quest out in the woods and things like that. Is that the same thing, being given one?
It's the same thing. It's the same.
Okay.
So you can do the vision quest, the spiritual quest, and you go and wait for a name. But also an elder can give you a name.
Okay.
And that's the way it happened for me in the community. There was a ceremony, an elder gave me a name on behalf of the community. So,
What was your name?
well, the name is Nanoshkas.
Which means?
Well, I would tell my gross brothers that it means thrusting spear of the male warrior. But in fact, it means hummingbird. And the reason that, well, again, this is relevant to the enculturation. The reason that was given to the group that this was the name for me is because the hummingbird searches for all the beautiful flowers. In other words, it brings out the beauty that's in nature. So this was the sense of bringing out the beauty in people was the name that they had given to me, which again comes from that enculturation aspect.
And hummingbirds themselves are beautiful.
Enough said.
Enough said. So you do that work for 7 years, and then you were tapped to be the provincial of the English-speaking Jesuits in Canada. How old were you?
I was 41, I think, 41 or 42.
Had you seen this appointment coming, or was it a complete shock?
It was a complete shock. I mean, one could have imagined it sometime down the road. I mean, I have certain administrative ability, and I could have imagined something like that. Not that I expected it, but no one in the province expected it at that time. But a Native woman had come to me. Here's another Native story. Earlier on in the year, in my last year there, and she said to me, "I had a dream. This will be your last year with us." And when Native people have a dream and say something, you listen to it, even if there's no other evidence.
Sure.
And it was about 4 months later that my name was proposed to be a provincial.
What were your thoughts at the time?
My thoughts were...
We're in the 80s here, like mid-80s?
That would have been 1996.
1996, okay.
Yeah. So my name arose in late 1995, and then the decision was made in early 1996, and that's when I became provincial. It was a complete shock to me, and it was one of these shocks that didn't have words. I was just sort of stunned, and they even joke about this at the province consultation, because they could see I was stunned,
right?
And which for them was a confirmation, you know. I was so shocked at it. But even that night, when I went to bed at night, there was this deep sense of confirmation that even though I didn't expect it, even though I didn't know what it would be about, that this was not a practical decision that the guys were making. This was what God was asking. It was very clear to me that it was a vocational thing. So I had to learn things very quickly, because although I was a member of the province, there were parts of the province I didn't know, and all the issues here and there. So there's a steep learning curve. But I must say I enjoyed it. There was a period of instruction in discernment, in apostolic discernment for me, that was very, how you make decisions, how you measure different values that are good values, all of them. How do you make a decision for the greater good, even though that might be difficult for some people, and to walk people through that without offending people. It was a very, very good learning experience.
Did you apply some of the techniques and learning methodologies and leadership skills that you had with Native peoples and bring it into your work as provincial?
Yeah, in fact, Native people had said that to me, and Jesuits said that to me. That was your preparation for being provincial. Because again, in a Native reality, you have, as well as all the beauty of the people, you have all of the social issues you can imagine. So you've got poverty, you've got alcoholic addiction, there's drugs, there's suicides, there's all sorts of difficult things. There's economic injustice in these communities. And you're figuring out, what is God asking of me? Well, there are all these problems here. What is he asking of the whole community of Native people? Because you can get lost in the morass of difficulties. You can lose your sight. And so that was a very rich challenge, to say, all of these things are going on. I'm not going to solve them all. God isn't asking me to solve them all. But where is he asking me to focus here? And that was really quite a fine instruction, and walking along with the people, and people who could see it too. So the things that we were able to do in the Native community were very significant, and a number of them were first-time things. And it was all because of that kind of discerned focus on, what is God asking of us in this complicated situation? So to walk with that into being provincial was, I would say, was a direct gift, a direct grace of preparation for that.
I'm sure you made 1,001 different decisions and discernments in that position. Looking back on it, What was the kind of the macro decision that you had to make in terms of like the biggest, like a directional change for the province that you look back on and say, this was accomplished and I'm grateful that I was able to do this?
Maybe there were two things, one sort of negative and one very positive. The negative one was that we had been a province of over 400 Jesuits, and when I was provincial, we were about 220 Jesuits. And far too many Jesuits were overextended. And you could just see from simple management point of view, we had to let things go, and even some very cherished things. So I brought this to the consultors, the governance community, and I said, we have to close a whole bunch of things for financial reasons, for manpower reasons, but also to purify, to simplify what we're doing. What is our focus? We can't be doing everything. So we made a decision at my instigation to close 16 different works, 16 different apostolates. A couple of them were quite large, many of them were small, and a couple of medium. But to close 16 was a very dramatic decision that really was an earthquake for the province.
Pastoral and academic institutions?
Yeah. Okay. And so it was a hard decision. Everybody saw that it sort of had to be. So there was resistance of letting go, but no one, because it was also done with prayer and all that, no one could deny that it had to be done or something of this grandeur had to be done. And no sooner was it done than everybody felt peace, in the sense that a guy had one solid job and not three. He was not overextended. There was more focus in every one of the apostolates. And now there was freedom to imagine, to recreate for a future, to imagine what our apostolic future would be. So that was a very good experience, because it's a tough decision, had to be made with all the appropriate conversations and discernment, and it released positive energy. It wasn't just dying, but it really was rising to something new. The other thing that I would say had lasting effect was we changed a bit the manner of governing the province. So Canada, the English province went from Halifax to Vancouver. It was the biggest province in the world at the time. And I would have to travel from Vancouver to Halifax or St. John's, Newfoundland is 8.5 hours nonstop on the jet. So we always had to have many meetings and communications to retain the unity, felt unity in the province. And one of the things that I really focused on was to bring together all of the superiors of all the communities together for regular meetings during the year. And we would make decisions that we would discuss, come together for 2 days at a time, discuss, pray, and make decisions for the future of the province. The change was this, that generations before me, you sort of looked for that lonely, tough individual leader who could make the decisions and go forward, and everybody would just dump everything on him and his immediate counselors. And what was clear to us was that we had to change that, make the decision-making much more inclusive, much more broadly felt, and that way everybody takes responsibility for them. So that, I would say, that was the lasting structural change we brought into the province when I was there.
That's great. Well, when we come back, let's switch to your 13 years in Ukraine and how that happened and what it was like for you. So thank you so much. We'll be right back. Back with Father David Nazar of the Society of Jesus, longtime friend. And we just finished stories of his life in the Society, education, working with First Nations people in Canada, and his role as Provincial of the English-speaking Jesuits in Canada. So Father Nazar, you finish your provincial post on the traditional day of St. Ignatius Day, July 31st. The year was?
2002.
2002. And had you been tapped on the shoulder before leaving office for a new position after you would leave the provincial office?
Yes, it was in the year 2000. A request was given to Father General Peter Hans Kolvenbach at the time from Russia. So what the Society had done was created a general region for the Society of Jesus after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it really was the Soviet Union. It was the same geographical thing. Then I was waiting to see where vocations would come from and all. And to be honest with you, I have expected a call in 1991 or 92 after the collapse, because they would be looking for people familiar with the Slavic countries and all. Nothing came. But then vocations were arriving, and the superior of this whole region of the former Soviet Union had heard about me, and we were at a conference in Spain. I was provincial at the time, and I'll tell you the story. There were, I forget how many, 200, 250 Jesuit provincials and assistants there and all this, and we're at some kind of social, and this guy across the room points out at me and yells, "We know where your mother is from." Now, as cryptic as that sounds, I knew exactly what this meant, because my mother was born in Ukraine and raised there, and this guy was the superior of this whole Russian region. So he asked for my permission to speak to Father Kolvenbach that I would be sent to Ukraine. And Father Kolvenbach said to me, "You have to finish your term as provincial, but there is a great need there, and it would be good if you could go." He didn't force me, but he said if you could go, it would be appreciated. And it made eminent sense, because now there are vocations coming from Ukraine, which is a deeply religious country and culture. The vocations were coming in significant number to all of the religious orders, and they needed someone who could handle the language, the Byzantine Rite and the Latin Rite and the whole governance structure and all that. So, as I always say, on paper, I look beautiful for a job like that, because I had all the qualifications.
Just like a hummingbird, just like a
hummingbird, yes.
So this was simmering on the back burner for the last 2 years of your 6-year provincial post then.
That's
Had
right.
you, in that year that you took off to travel in Europe, did you go to Ukraine, your home country, from where your parents were
No,
born?
but when I was in theology, it was still the Soviet Union, 1982, I went to take a month's worth of study of the language. So I went to Kiev and to Lviv, where my mother is from, and I spent a month studying Ukrainian with about 6 other people, because I was expecting ordination and to be able to be of service if needed in the Ukrainian church in Canada. So so this was my second time in Ukraine.
So you had grown up speaking Ukrainian, but you needed a refresher course in terms of kind of getting back fully into the language.
Yeah, for sure, because we were raised in Ukrainian until we started school.
Okay.
So in other words, my vocabulary was limited to the kitchen and to the bathroom.
Okay, very good.
So I couldn't have carried on a conversation about, what's on the street or what's happening in politics or anything like that.
Okay.
So I had the basics of the language, I had the liturgical language, but I did have to build up a lot of vocabulary and facility in the language.
Describe what Ukraine was like the year that you got there in terms of political, the post-Soviet era. What did you discover? What was the most kind of difficult or shocking or remarkable thing that you experienced when you got there?
2 things. One was the poverty, and the other was the psycho-spiritual health of the people. Imagine this, that we're flying into Lviv. Lviv was a city of 1 million. And before this, you have to realize that these countries were not receiving many tourists. Refugees weren't running into these countries. Mm-hmm. And so they were not built for receiving people or for hospitality. So the plane, as it's coming down, is flying over really small and not well-kept fields, all sorts of buildings and garages and sheds. I mean, there was really the impression of a real poverty. The plane lands in the middle of a kind of a tarmac, and coming to the plane is like a World War II vintage truck. And attached to the back of the truck is an open cattle car. That was our transit bus from the plane to the terminal. And it said everything. It said everything you needed to know. And then you would see that the streets with potholes, you could see that during the Soviet period, they had not improved anything. They didn't paint buildings, Soviet monuments, yes. But in terms of just normal infrastructure, it wasn't there. And of course, nobody had a car. In fact, if you had a television, you'd be under suspicion by the police, because how could you possibly afford a television? But the other thing to me was very striking, which was the psychological health of the people. Because I went there expecting a people angry, with repressed emotions, with fears, with hatreds of neighboring countries, especially of Russians. Also, there was a Polish-Ukrainian history. I expected tons and tons of this repressed feelings and psychological issues and acting them out in terms of whether sexually or with alcohol or with whatever, or violence. Right. And I found an extraordinarily healthy people. Now, this is especially in Western Ukraine. And clearly one of the reasons for it was that the church was very active in the underground in all of this period. The church in contradistinction with, say, Poland or Slovakia, where the church could still live, but always at war with the government, the Catholic Church was forbidden in Ukraine, the bigger one, the Byzantine Church. So there was no contest with the government, but it was underground because everyone was quite devout. So there were seminary formation, there were ordinations, there were all sorts of things. Grandmothers taught their grandchildren how to pray. People prayed in their homes with regularity. Everybody was baptized. Everybody got First Communion, and everybody had the sacraments when they were dying. And for the most part, the authorities knew but turned a blind eye to the thing. But I'm sure that this was the reason why the people retained a healthy sense of who they were. They knew that they were living under a repressive and unjust regime, and they knew equally well that this regime would die, that they didn't need to internalize its violence. One day it would be gone, and they would rise again. And that spirit was very, very strong among the people, such that there was no difficulty speaking with them about anything when I got there. I must say that impressed me so much. Also, their creativity. They were quite willing to take risks, travel to other countries to work, to send money back home. The government was clouded by communist corruption. And so the people made the greatest economic difference for the country by going to Portugal, by going to different countries within the European Union to work for 6 months because they needed construction workers, to go to Italy and to Spain because elders needed people to care for them in their homes. And the money that they would make would be a pittance in those countries. When I went to Ukraine, the average monthly salary was $100.
Wow, amazing.
So if they could send back the equivalent of $100 or $200 a month from wherever they were working, this was a gold mine for the families. So the people then started buying cars, started buying goods, and they're the ones who really transformed the economy of Ukraine. And I say that because you could just see this positive energy in the people, that they did not collapse into depression, saying, oh, we can't change anything. That spirit was there and remained strong among the people.
And for your work as a Jesuit superior of the Jesuits in Ukraine, how many Jesuits were there in Ukraine when you got started and at the end of your time of 13 years?
So I think the difference was when I got there were maybe about 8, and when I left there were 16. So the Jesuits have a very high reputation, even a complicated reputation in Ukraine at the time. So I think a lot of young men would have been intimidated to enter the Jesuits. And I would say this worked to our favor because we got very good young men who had the courage of their convictions, who were willing to risk something, and who had real talents. And so what we were able to do with a small number, for example, virtually all of the retreats in the country, 48-day retreats a year, the Jesuits were giving them. So the publications that we did, and the books that spiritual works that we translated, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Ignatius' biography, all of these we were translating regularly year by year into Ukrainian. So we had a great effect. We opened a house for refugees because now refugees were trying to get to the European Union through Ukraine and many of them would be caught. So we were even helping the government develop refugee policies because of the Jesuit Refugee Service, which we initiated there. So it was an exciting time. You're watching a country grow from a time of great repression, all this creative energy ready to explode as soon as the pressure was released, and then all sorts of things happening. And the church only became more and more important year by year for people. Very high attendance at church in the country in a very authentic way, that God walks with me in my everyday life.
It's interesting, in times of kind of repression and persecution, faith is stronger. I did a portion of my Jesuit formation in Northern Ireland where the troubles were still very much present, and the people's faith was very strong. You know, you hang on to that during times of difficulty. It becomes much more important. Did you have at the time, David, when you were in Ukraine, did you have dealings with the Russian Orthodox, and did you have to do any ecumenical work between the Byzantine Rite Catholics and the Russian Orthodox?
Not the Russian Orthodox. The Russian Orthodox are in a very difficult situation in Ukraine. There were 3 Orthodox churches in Ukraine, 2 Ukrainian Orthodox churches and the Russian Orthodox Church. We had intimate collaborations with the 2 Ukrainian Orthodox churches. There was no issue at all. I was even a spiritual director for one of the Orthodox bishops. All of that worked very commonly, very smoothly. The Russian Orthodox Church was complicated because it was the only church juridically allowed to operate in the Soviet times, but it was very controlled. So if people wanted to go to church, whether they were Russian or they could speak Russian or not, that was the only church that was available to go to. So many would go there. And then it might have been the only church in the village. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, people would be going there who weren't attached to the Russian Orthodox Church, but it was the only church available. So as the national identity was growing, as the church was growing, the Russian Orthodox Church from Moscow, in coordination with Putin, the church was being used as a weapon to a certain extent to repress the other churches. The Russian Orthodox Church still says today that the Ukrainian Orthodox churches are illegitimate. The only legitimate Orthodox Church in Ukraine is the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, you can imagine that for people of a strong Ukrainian identity, to hear that is a bit offensive and difficult.
Right.
I had perhaps two good Russian Orthodox priest friends in Ukraine. They were very good. There were other Orthodox priests who would be talking with me, would be like talking with Satan. I was born of Satan because I was Catholic and all that kind of stuff. And that's a conflict within the Russian Orthodox Church that isn't yet resolved. So the ecumenical work with the Ukrainian Orthodox churches, which represent a larger percentage of the population than the Russian Orthodox Church, collaboration with them was very easy.
When I was at Georgetown, we had a visit with the Patriarch of Moscow, and we had a meeting with him in the offices of mission and ministry, and we were told to be very careful about what we said, because many of the Russian Orthodox priests traveling with them, we were told by the authorities in Washington that they were probably deeply infiltrated by the KGB, and that things that we would say would be carried back to authorities in Moscow. The Orthodox Church was deeply compromised during the Soviet era. Is it still that way? Does it still have a long way to go to recover? Is there pure faith in the Russian Orthodox Church? How do you see it from your post?
You have to speak with great respect, in one sense, about the Russian Orthodox Church, because it's in a very complicated situation. The Russian Orthodox Church cannot be seen to contradict Putin, cannot be seen to contradict the government. And in that, it's already lost 30% or more of the mission of the church.
Sure.
If the mission of the church is to be prophetic and to speak to society about what are the social needs and everything, there are many things to criticize in Russia that are Russian state policies. So it's very difficult for the Russian Orthodox Church to speak openly. When, for example, the current Patriarch Kirill met with Pope Francis in Cuba, first of all, he couldn't meet with the Pope in Europe and certainly not in Russia. It would not have been possible. When he met with him in Cuba, a large number of monks in monasteries, and this was public in the press, said we can no longer pray for the Patriarch because he has met with the Antichrist. There was a theologian in Moscow at one of the Moscow universities who said, now we have a clear choice between the true faith and the Patriarch.
Wow.
So, and the Patriarch knows this, and so it's difficult for him, even if he wants to criticize the government, if he does, he's going to cause a split in his church.
Sure.
So that's why I say they have to have a kind of a respect for the church and the situation that it's in, but it's still not free.
This is kind of a sidebar, but your comment about splitting the church remind me of the situation currently in Germany with the German hierarchy and their kind of own synodal way. What do you think is going to happen there?
I don't know, and I won't pretend. We would hear stories on it, but really my field now is the Eastern churches. So.
Okay. So before we leave this section on your work in Ukraine, looking back, what is the thing that you are most consoled by in the work that you did there?
Well, one was to assist in the redemption of the image of the Jesuits. Now, this might sound like a funny thing, but Ignatius has this expression that Jesuits should go to work where cockle has been sown. In other words, where the reputation of the Jesuits has been damaged, the reputation of the church has been damaged, and it might be difficult, but that's where we should go. And the reputation of the Jesuits was complicated because it had been Polish Jesuits working in Ukraine for several centuries, and they were of the Latin Rite. And there were tensions at times of saying that, well, you Byzantine people, you should all just be rebaptized and enter the Latin Rite, and there wasn't a clear understanding of what these rites were. At the same time, the Jesuits were highly respected for their spiritual depth and for their intellectual acumen. So it had this kind of complicated image. So I go there with a Ukrainian name, a Ukrainian background. I'm Byzantine Rite, born and raised and all. And already that was a shock for people, that a Jesuit could be Byzantine Rite. And then almost all of the guys that entered us were of the Byzantine Rite. Now this was very rich, because we went and all of our work was spiritual work, was pastoral work, was university work. We were with people all the time. And slowly people saw the Jesuits are ours. The Jesuits aren't foreigners or from another church. The Jesuits belong here. So that has great apostolic importance, because it just opened so many doors for us, even the work with refugees. The other thing I would say that was very important was the spiritual work. It was the work of the spiritual exercises. As I mentioned, that when I got there, I was the only one, or there were two of us who were giving the spiritual exercises. I would give about 8 or 10 8-day retreats a year, and there'd be 20 people on each of these 8-day retreats, and I would be having individual conversations with all of them. It was really too much, but there was no other option. And then slowly, as the other Jesuits were coming out of formation, they were doing this retreat work. And then lay people, and we had one of the guys after me, he had an 8-day Ignatian spiritual exercises for pregnant moms.
Wow, amazing, great.
And the place was full, So
Wonderful.
the youth come out, all sorts of categories of lay people, priests and sisters. I gave the exercises to 15 bishops at one stage. So there's a real spiritual thirst, and one real answer for that spiritual thirst was the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. So as I say, now the Jesuits that are there, they give about 40 retreats a year, 8-day retreats.
That's wonderful. Great,
Yeah.
great work of Ignatius. There's nothing more powerful than the exercises well delivered and well received. When we come back, we're going to end with your work in Rome at the Pontifical Oriental Institute. So we're going to take a short break right now. We join Father David Nazar on Jesuit Podcast for this last section, looking at his current work in Rome, where in 2015, Father General Pope Francis named Father Nazar the rector, we would say president in the United States, of the Pontifical Oriental Institute. So, Father Nazar, congratulations. This is where we reconnected after many years. Tell us how this position came to you, and when you began in 2015, what you faced, and a little bit about the history of the work of the Orientale.
Yeah, so the Orientale was created directly by the popes, by Benedict XV, but it was really Leo XIII at the end of the 1800s. He saw the richness of all these Eastern churches at a Eucharistic Congress in Jerusalem. And all these guys come in with the big funny hats and the gold clothes and all this kind of stuff. And he realized
they've got much better outfits than the Roman guys do.
It's just so attractive. In fact, a lot of people enter the Eastern rites for the smoke and the gold, it's just
right.
And he had this passionate concern that many of these Eastern rites are small, or even if they are mid-sized, they don't have the resources for a higher education. So he started this idea of opening up a graduate school, basically, a university of higher studies for all of the Eastern rites of the church. So we're talking about an area that goes from Russia to Ethiopia and Africa, and from southern Italy to India, and everything in between. The whole Middle East, Egypt, Turkey, and all those countries, Ukraine and Bulgaria.
About how many rites is that, David?
So there's 24.
24.
There's 24 in the Catholic Communion. Each of those Catholic ones would have a corresponding Orthodox one, and there are other Orthodox places. Okay. So this place was established, this is very interesting, it was established as an ecumenical institution when the word ecumenism was not used.
Interesting.
It was established for Orthodox and Catholics to come and study their own resources and to make those resources available to the West. So that was the inspiration. And it was doing foundational work for its first 100 years, finding the original manuscripts, studying the liturgies, the original languages. There are many liturgies that disappeared in the first few centuries. Other liturgies grew out of them. It was finding those manuscripts, analyzing them, studying them for their theology, language, and all. Also developing church disciplines like canon law. A lot of these churches operated by traditions, which included norms, but what was it? What was a tradition, and what was really normative? So this institution here put together the code of canon law for all of the Eastern churches. So there are major works that were done here. The liturgy, a famous one of John Chrysostom, the main study of that liturgy was done here, and so on and so forth. Many manuscripts we have here available. So the first 100 years was really doing all this original research, making these riches available. In fact, I could say to you this, that the popularity of icons that you now see in the West, you go to so many monasteries or chapels in the United States and you see there's an icon, that became popular after Vatican II. One of the reasons was because our people had prepared documents for Vatican II, and Vatican II was the first Vatican Council that really published a decree on the importance of the Eastern churches. And from then, even the whole notion of lay deacons in the church, when the West was thinking of doing that, they had to go to the East and say, what's a deacon? What are the documents? Because the deacons were retained in the Eastern churches. So it was the richness of the Eastern churches that were able to give guidance for the formation of the lay diaconate of the Western church. So this work had gone on very well, academic work, Orthodox and Catholic, mostly Catholic, but Orthodox and Catholic studying here. And then in 2015, there were some crises of management here. There was a great revolt against the president of the university, not through his fault, but there had been growing divisions among the faculty. And there hadn't been someone in administration or in spiritual governments who could sort of bring the guys together and say, listen, we got some issues here, we have to work them through. It festered and festered and festered until it exploded. And the Father General intervened, asked for the dismissal, or the resignation of all the office holders in the Orientale, and then had to establish a new administration for the place. And of course, everyone was in agreement because the place had just sort of blown up.
Sure.
And everything. But notwithstanding the fact that it was still doing very good academic work, but at a human level, it was a difficult place to live in.
That's right.
So again, the Father General at that time, or his assistant, said to me, listen, I was in Ukraine at the time, he said, listen, there is this problem there. Would you like to go there and be the rector? And I think it surprised him when I said to him, well, sure, if you want, I'll go. I think he thought that he was going to have to argue with me and convince me to do it. But I think the thing for me was that after 13 years in Ukraine, I would be happy to stay there for the rest of my life. But I knew that I had done the job that I was asked to do.
Sure.
And it's always good when you can leave and leave it to the others to share that responsibility with them. So it seemed to me to come at an appropriate time. So then the suggestion was made to the Vatican and the appointment by the Pope to take the position.
This is a humorous point because your appointment was announced on the National Jesuit News Network. And I said, I'm going to have to send David a congratulation email. So I dug up your email and just said, congratulations, David, on your appointment. We'll have to catch up. And I think within an hour, I got a 7-page cry from the heart email about the disaster that you had inherited. And it was so awful, I was just laughing out loud.
Well,
I said, I guess it's not as glamorous as it sounds.
That's right. I might have been crying from the heart, but I was also quite excited by it because it's a nice kind of challenge. Because what I could see fairly quickly was basic principles of Jesuit governance and Jesuit community life were not operative here. So it's kind of clear the direction that things had to go. And I like that kind of thing where you have to resolve conflicts by bringing people together. You have to open the conversation among people and they resolve the conflicts effectively. So it's creating processes and environment for that to take place, which was a challenge. That was really the work of first year. But it's true, there were financial problems, there were administrative problems, there were personnel problems, building structure problems, but once guys started to meet, well, we came up with a new vision for the place and a 10-year plan, and you were very generous to come on board and to help with the fundraising possibilities and schemes and all that kind of stuff, and helping us to develop a sort of public profile with the internet and our social media and all that. So, you could just feel the sea change here within the place.
Yeah, it's been amazing. I have to tell the listeners that I do have a connection because when I reached out to David, I gradually got involved in development work, first through the Gregorian University Foundation, and now as fundraiser for the Orientale specifically. COVID has really kind of put a big damper on our trips and our plans. But you have been able to accomplish at the Orientale things that I think that the other two Jesuit institutions, the Biblicum and the Greg, have not been able to in terms of infrastructure updating, technology upgrades, classroom stuff, and a real kind of a forward vision for the 21st century. So why don't you talk about some of those accomplishments?
Yeah, well, there are some things here that, I mean, in one sense, it's good to have a North American here in some of these positions because people who've been here for a long time and we all have this. There's a certain lethargy. You say, well, this is the way it always was. This is the way it is now. This is the way it always will be.
That's right. It's always worked for us just fine, even though it's not working.
Well, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. So, for example, the chairs in our main auditorium hall were bought in the 1920s. Now, it's a testament to their durability that they were still there. They were all wooden chairs, but that's kind of an image of how things were. So we were able to put together find some money together, and again, generous benefactors. And we had written this plan, all of us together here, of what we wanted to see over the next 10 years. So it wasn't as though I came up with a bunch of ideas and I have a bunch of rich friends. No, you knew that God was speaking through this because everybody said the same thing. These are the things we have to work on and move forward. And my experience always is that when the voice of the people is somehow the voice of God, I mean, there can be sins and errors and all that kind of stuff, but when in prayer, in open and honest conversation, people come together and we're looking to fulfill the mission of God here, and we come up with a very practical plan for 10 years. Well, if God is inspiring these people to do this, he's going to come up with the means to get the stuff done. And I think that was the thing that surprised an awful lot of people. So some of the things that would surprise our non-Roman audience is that there was no air conditioning in the building. Now you imagine sitting in the library through all the summer months, and warm weather can start here even at the end of March. So let's say from April until October, you would be sweating in the library on your manuscripts as you're doing your research and study.
As the books are moldering on the shelves too.
That's right. So we redid the main conference hall, which is part of the library, and we even, to a certain extent, were inspired by the aesthetics of the Georgetown Library. I think it's called Riggs Library.
Riggs Library, right?
Yeah. And so we used a bit of that aesthetic in the place. Well, it just transformed everybody's imagination, that you can actually change something in these things, that you can actually make these places beautiful, that you can actually put in high quality lighting, air conditioning, and comfortable seats. Can this be done?
The room had good bones, but it was really a dump.
That's right. Well, again, that just broke open a bunch of naive resistances that you say, well, we can't do this because it's never been done. And when people saw it being done, then all of the other things that we wanted to do on this 10-year plan became much more realizable. So we were the first place to put in a high-end technology in all of the classrooms in the place. So we basically used Google, but with major television screens, with cameras and microphones, wiring all of the classrooms together. I think we are the only place, maybe by now there's been some change after COVID, but I think we're probably still the only place that has all of our classrooms wired for that.
There are quite a few institutions in Rome that are managed or under the auspices of the church, and you probably are the most up-to-date technologically.
That would be fair. There's 22 of these academic institutions, and we would be the most advanced technologically. That would be true. We even studied things like and these are great studies and interesting studies, but they're out there. What are the colors that help you study? What is the light intensity? How many lumens per square meter do you have to have for high quality study? How does the quality of air affect the quality of students? And the studies are very clear. And the studies in Europe say the very same thing as the studies in the United States and in Canada. So it was kind of a slam dunk to say, oh, the other one is acoustics. What's the level of acoustics that impedes learning and that you should have for high quality learning? So some of these things are not expensive. Some of them are a bit more expensive.
Sure.
And we started bit by bit putting them in. And I use this story because I have never experienced this myself or heard anybody say this. But after we did these changes and we adjusted the acoustics and we adjusted the lighting and the colors of the classrooms, students were saying, my favorite classroom is that one. And professor, my favorite classroom is that one. Well, I don't ever remember saying my favorite classroom anywhere, in any of the universities I've been to. But you could sense that color, lighting, and acoustics made a really qualitative difference to your presence, to your attention in the classrooms.
It affects you emotionally, psychologically, intellectually. It has a kind of a holistic impact on you.
Exactly. And what the COVID situation inspired us to do was to collaborate with a very generous company in New York, Delos. They were offering to help us in whatever ways that they could. One of the founders, he's in fact Palestinian, and he didn't know that there was a university that just studied Eastern things here. So he was quite impressed by it. We had a good friendship that we developed. And then he said, tell us how we can help you. So COVID comes along, and what we wanted to do was to guarantee the air quality in the building. So we were able to put together money for air conditioning, and they provided air purifiers for the building. So now in all of the classrooms we have air conditioning, not just air cooling, but air conditioning, air exchange, and filters that take up 99.97% of bacteria, virus, dust, odors out of the classroom.
Pollens, right?
Pollens, all that. And so, yeah, and again, it's one of those things where it's a small thing, but a significant enough thing that you know that the air is clear. It gives you psychological security. I'm not going to get COVID in these classrooms. But then also you feel a strange, this is nice to be here. I'm not tired after an hour of a class or a meeting, as I would have in some of these rooms. And there's no sense of the air getting stale and all that. It has had a real positive effect on the environment, yeah.
And the ecumenical work continues. You have several fairly prominent Russian Orthodox graduates of the Orientale, don't you?
So, and even more Armenian Orthodox and Maronites from Lebanon. We have excellent now, a great increase in lay students. So, for example, we have a woman from Baghdad. She was born in 1981 and has already lived through 4 wars. So the Iran-Iraq War and the other wars that the United States is very well aware of. She is full of life and full of joy, and she's very intelligent. She can analyze these things to the end. And she is one who says, if the churches have to be alive, because they are the ones who build up these countries. And when you look at the history of those countries, it's true. It wasn't political leaders, but it was the churches that made the schools, that made the political philosophies, that opened the hospitals, did all the social services. And she says it's going to be the churches that do this again. It won't be the governments, and it won't be infighting with all due respect, among the various Islamic groups. Many Muslims support this work, but a lot of it comes from Christian inspiration. A woman from Egypt, from Cairo, same sort of thing. They're doing doctorates here in theology and looking at their ancient manuscripts in order to go back and bring the riches of their cultures back to their own countries for the building up of their countries. Same thing with Romanians, same thing with Bulgarians from Turkey, from Lebanon, Syria. These are you feel yourself really at the vortex of crucial issues of our time, you know. And the voice of the church, it's the voice of the prophet, it's the voice of justice, it's the voice of the presence of God, is crucial to making a difference in these countries. It will not be through the inspiration of the 7 or 8 international countries who are trading arms in those countries who are going to save them. It's going to be the people themselves and on the basis of solid spiritual and human values. So again, you just feel yourself so co-involved with at the root level of these countries of what's going on.
Yeah, it has that change has to happen from the bottom up. That was again my experience in Northern Ireland, where there had been troubles for so many years. And I said to myself one day, this is only going to end when the people say no more. We will not allow this to go on. So it really has to come up. So we could go on for hours. So let me just kind of make this kind of summary connection here. You don't take credit for much of the things that you have done, but you are like that hummingbird. You go around and you've shown the native peoples in Canada what is possible in terms of how to manifest their culture through liturgy. You brought the superiors of the English-speaking Jesuits in Canada together to make them co-responsible for changes that they knew probably needed to happen but couldn't see how to do it, so you gently guided them. Did the same thing in Ukraine by revealing yourself as Ukrainian and as Byzantine so that they could see themselves in a new way, and you're doing that in Rome too with the Orientale, where you certainly have provided leadership and you've shown the people who are there what is possible. So that takes a real vision, that takes a big heart and a firm hand. And so I think you are a remarkable leader, and I am very grateful to call you a friend, and I hope we can continue to do great work at the Orientale in the future.
As long as you're with us, Bill, we'll do great work at the Orientale in the future.
Well, it's good. For the success of that and for your work, could you end us with a prayer for ourselves and all of our listeners?
Native people would always say the most powerful prayer is the prayer of thanksgiving. It helps us to remember that God is there in all things. So I want to thank you, loving God, our Father, through Jesus himself, for the many gifts and inspirations you give to us. We ask you mercy on all our sins against creation, against the salvation you offer to us, against the inspiration of your Holy Spirit. But we give you great thanks for the prayers that you answer and the prayers that you inspire in us, the energy you give to us to serve you and make the world as beautiful as you want it to be. We bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father David. Great being with you, and I'll hope to see you in Rome in not too distant future.
I can hardly wait. Take care.
This has been Sacred Story Institute Jesuit Podcast with Father Bill Watson. If you liked our program, please subscribe to our podcast channel. And may God bless you.